Today on the Pitchbook Podcast, we have a very special doubleheader for you. Zach is pitching The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I'm pitching Gulag by Anne Applebaum. Batter up! All right, Zach, we should probably explain what a doubleheader is to the folks at home. One of the things we do in the Pitchbook Podcast is we don't ever tell each other what we're going to pitch. And you happen to mention, and I try to stop you, but you will always do like, oh man, I was reading this awesome book. I can't wait to pitch it. Don't tell me. And you told me, and I said, oh, actually, I read something really similar. Let me reread it because it's so crazy long and dense. And then we'll do a doubleheader. I think you came up with the idea of a doubleheader. So that's what it is. We have no idea. This is a doubleheader is going to go long, so prepare yourselves at home. Sit back, have a nice cool drink, Diet Coke, whatever you drink, and enjoy the episode, if you can call it that. Enjoying this one, but fascinating books that we're going to talk about today, and I'm really excited for this episode. Zach, why don't you start? Tell us how you found the book, and then we'll go from there.
All right. So where I first heard of this book was on a podcast. I believe it was Jordan Peterson. He talks about different Russian authors, and one of the books he said everyone absolutely should read is Gulag Archipelago. So I put that down in my books to read. That was 3 or 4 years ago, and hadn't really thought about it much. And then I was going through the books to read. I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna do this one. I'm gonna look it up. And so I didn't really know what Gulag Archipelago was about. I researched it, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn is a prolific writer. He wrote 3 volumes about this prison system in Russia.
Yeah, we should probably explain what Gulag is, right? For those who don't know. The Gulag, so just real quick, is it actually an acronym? Russian, I don't know the Russian actual words for it, but it's an acronym, and it's basically the prison forced labor system in Russia from like 1913 to the 80s, 90s. That's fair?
That's about right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Early teens in the 1900s, and went on for a very, very long time. So that's where I heard the book. I listened to it first, the audio version of volume 1, and that's the book that I'm gonna review today. I feel very underqualified to review this work, but agreed. I do think it's something that everyone should read. After reading it and listening to it, it is a reminder that when we have get to extremes inside of countries' political systems, one way or another, it can only end badly. And this is one of those situations. So I'm going to read a piece on Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This is from Wikipedia, just to give you some background of his story, and then we'll dive into the book from his perspective. And he was collecting stories from other people that had been through the Gulag Archipelago, their own personal experience. So a lot of these are his experiences, other people's experiences, all combined into one work. So Alexander, his lifetime span from December 11th, 1918 to August 3rd, 2008, was a Russian writer and prominent Soviet dissident who helped raise global awareness of political repression in the Soviet Union, especially the Gulag prison system. Solzhenitsyn was born into a family that defied the Soviet anti-religious campaign in the 1920s and remained devout members of the Russian Orthodox Church. However, Solzhenitsyn initially lost his faith in Christianity, became an atheist, and embraced Marxism, Leninism while serving as a captain in the Red Army during World War II. Solzhenitsyn was arrested by Smersh and sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag, and then internal exile for criticizing Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in a private letter. As a result of his experience in prison and the camps, he gradually became a philosophically minded Eastern Orthodox Christian. As a result, the Khrushchev thaw, Solzhenitsyn, was released and exonerated. He pursued writing novels about repression in the Soviet Union and his experiences. He published his first novel called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich in 1962, with approval from Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, which was an account of Stalinist repressions. Solzhenitsyn's last work to be published in the Soviet Union was Marchiona's Place in 1963. Following the removal of Khrushchev from power, the Soviet authorities attempted to discourage Solzhenitsyn from continuing to write. He continued to work on further novels and their publication in other countries, including Cancer Ward in 66, The First Circle in 1968, August 1914 in 1971, and the Gulag Archipelago in 1973, the publication of which outraged Soviet authorities. In 1974, Solzhenitsyn was stripped of his Soviet citizenship and flown to West Germany. In 1976, he moved with his family to the United States, where he continued to write. In 1990, shortly before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, his citizenship was restored, and 4 years later, he returned to Russia, where he remained until his death in 2008. He was awarded the 1970 Nobel Prize in Literature, quote, for the ethical force with which he has pursued the indispensable traditions of Russian literature. And the Gulag Archipelago was highly influential work that amounted to head-on challenge to the Soviet state and sold tens of millions of copies. What was interesting, when I ordered this book, it was very hard to find just a paperback copy. Most books, you can order them, they show up the next day.
Yeah.
The copy that I have is an original, and it's hard bound, or it's it's like hardwood, hardcover. It's the old, I don't know what kind of canvasy color book. It's like the 1970s when they
It looks like a textbook from my youth, basically.
It didn't feel like a textbook. Reading it, he has a great sense of humor. There were parts where I laughed out loud, just the way that the situation was so terrible, but his sarcasm in the book comes through, So he had I think, a pretty good sense of humor, and I need to go see if he did any public interviews. Just really interesting guy. So what I thought I would start off with, Matt, is the book goes through chapter by chapter how somebody would experience an arrest, an interrogation, being put in a prison cell, being tortured, working in the labor camps. I'm not going to hit every chapter, but I want to hit some of the highlights of these chapters. As I was reading, there just are paragraphs that really jump out at you. So the first part in the book, in the first very beginning pages, he talks about the arrests, when you would be arrested. So one of the methods of being arrested, generally they would like to arrest you at night. When you think you're in your bed, you're asleep, you're not really expecting anything, and then all of a sudden someone breaks into your house. You're discombobulated, you're not quite awake, you don't know what's going on. So that was their preferred method of arresting people, was during the evening. So in the night arrests, this is on page 6, the kind of night arrest described is, in fact, a favorite because it has important advantages. Everyone living in the apartment is thrown into a state of terror by the first knock at the door. The arrested person is torn from the warmth of his bed. He is in a daze, half asleep, helpless, and his judgment is befogged. In a night arrest, the state security men have a superiority in numbers. There are many of them armed against one person who hasn't even finished buttoning his trousers. During the arrest and search, it is highly improbable that a crowd of potential supporters will gather at the entrance. So he talks about the arrests that happen at night, people not expecting it, being arrested. You don't know what you're being arrested for. There's not like Miranda rights that they read to you. Do you understand why you're being arrested? They just take you. He said, they take you aside in a factory corridor after you had your pass checked and you're arrested. They take you from a military hospital with a temperature of 102, as they did with Ans Bernstein. And the doctor will not raise a peep about your arrest. Just let him try. they'll take you right off the operating table as they took N.M. Vorbiev, a school inspector in 1936, in the middle of an operation for stomach ulcer, and drag you off to a cell as they did him, half alive and all bloody, as Karpunich recollects. So it was just really interesting. Like, they'd come into your workplace. Generally, they would do the arrests at night, but they would just take you, if you're in the middle of an operation and you're vulnerable, haul you off to a prison.
Didn't he? So spoiler alert. You mentioned that we're going to do these books, and so I I listened to about the first quarter of Gulag Archipelago, and so I remember him. Doesn't he talk about people meeting on the train and like, oh, just hey, come meet with me, or like, hey, they just walk up to you in public too sometimes and say, hey, I know you, don't I know you? And then they say, come with
Yes.
me, we got to go here, uh, things like that.
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
crazy.
Very sneakily. Like,
Yeah,
hey, can I talk to you for a second? And
yeah,
you're kind of wondering what's going on.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And when that would happen, he said, then should you run away? And how can you resist right then? After all, you'll only make your situation worse, make it more difficult for them to sort out the mistake. And it isn't just that you don't put up any resistance, you even walk down the stairs on tiptoe as you're ordered to do, so your neighbors won't hear. So there's this real psychological fear around, why am I being arrested? Leave me alone. I didn't do anything. What's going on?
All right.
It's like immediately people would shut down, realizing what's happening, and didn't want to make it worse for themselves. So all around you, there's people. There's this Article 58. If I can jump into that here for a second, because you wonder, well, what would give the authorities the privilege to just arrest you for no reason at all? And when he talks about the Gulag Archipelago, there's a section, or Article 58, that outlines all of the different ways that you could be arrested. Treason by military personnel. They could really make up anything that they wanted to. There were a lot of the most popular was 58-10, which was the anti-Soviet and counter-revolutionary propaganda and agitation. Now that
Yeah.
seems very broad, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, I don't like the
Well,
president. I don't like
somebody
Stalin. Boom, you're in jail.
somebody would make a joke, right? And someone would
Yes,
overhear it and say, "Oh, that Zach was, making a joke about Stalin. He must be, anti-communist or something." And you got to go
right.
arrest him.
And not only that, but if you heard a joke and didn't report it, you were guilty as well.
Exactly.
So you end up with this uh, panopticon, which is a fancy word for a prison system where there's a tower in the middle and it's surrounded by all of these cells. And if you're in the cell, you don't know if the tower is looking at you or watching you, but they were able to establish this, I'll call it a panopticon, where you don't know which of your neighbors are loyal to the communist regime. And so you're afraid to speak, you're afraid to talk to anybody, to joke, because you're afraid that they'll just turn you in. And they're afraid if they don't turn you in for saying something and they hear something, that they'll be arrested.
Yeah.
So just the arrest process was very sneaky, very light terms. And of course, when they arrest you, they then haul you off to be interrogated.
So let me jump in really quick, because when I first read this book, or at least my book, I was almost surprised that they had it's kind of a joke trial system a lot of times, but they try to get people to confess, right? And they interrogate them and torture them to confess. But it's interesting that it's almost like Stalin wants them to admit that they're doing something wrong. He could just take these people and put them in jail. There was no real, authority that's going to stop him. But he almost went out of his way to make sure people confess to being anti-Stalin or something. It's very strange.
Right. and you don't know, I'll get into the interrogation here in a second, but some of the people that they first attacked was religion.
Mhm.
So on this is on page 37. It says, however, the root destruction of religion in the country, which throughout the 20s and 30s was one of the most important goals of the GPU-NKVD. This is their secret police, could be realized only by mass arrests of Orthodox believers, monks and nuns whose black habits had been a distinctive feature of old Russian life, were intensively rounded up on every hand, placed under arrest and sent into exile. They arrested and sentenced active laymen. The circles kept getting bigger and bigger as they ranked in ordinary believers as well. Old people, and particularly women, who were the most stubborn believers of all, and who for many long years to come would be called nuns, in transit prisons and in camps. True, they were supposedly being arrested and tried not for their actual faith, but for openly declaring their convictions and for bringing up their children in the same spirit. As Tanya Kodovich wrote, you can pray freely, but just so God alone can hear. So there was a very open attack on religion, faiths, people that were arrested. They would take your gold if you were arrested and starve you. You could not have any water or anything to drink until you absolutely gave up all of your possessions. He kind of joked. He said, whoever coughed up gold got water, one piece of gold for one cup of fresh water. So the situation was just absolutely horrible.
He goes into the types of interrogation that they do, right?
He does.
And I don't know how detailed we want to get here, but it's pretty brutal. It's pretty crazy.
But before I jump into that, can I share one last story?
Of course.
Okay. So this is in the book. This is a vignette of a party meeting. So just to give you an example of how people were, the mindset. He says, here is one vignette from those years as it actually occurred. A district party conference was underway in Moscow province. It was presided over by a new secretary of the district party committee, replacing the one recently arrested. Ironically, at the conclusion of the conference, a tribute to the comrade Stalin was called for. Of course, everyone stood up, just as everyone had leaped to his feet during the conference at every mention of his name. The small hall echoed with a stormy applause, rising to an ovation. For 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, the stormy applause rising to an ovation continued. But palms were getting sore and raised arms were already aching, and the older people were panting from exhaustion. It was becoming insufferably silly, even to those who really adored Stalin. However, who would dare to be the first to stop? The secretary of the district party committee could have done it. He was standing on the platform, and it was he who had just called for the ovation, but he was a newcomer. He had taken the place of a man who'd been arrested. He was afraid. After all, NKVD men were standing in the hall applauding and watching to see who would quit first. And in that obscure small hall, unknown to the leader, the applause went on. The applause went on 6, 7, 8 minutes. They were done for. Their goose was cooked. They couldn't stop now till they collapsed with heart attacks. At the rear of the hall, which was crowded, they could, of course, cheat a bit, clap less frequently, less vigorously, not so eagerly, but up there with the presidium, where everyone could see them, the director of the local paper factory, an independent and strong-minded man, stood with the presidium, aware of all the falsity and all the impossibility of the situation. He still kept applauding. 9 minutes, 10, in anguish, he watched the secretary of the district party committee, but the latter dared not stop. Insanity to the last man, with make-believe enthusiasm on their faces, looking at each other with faint hope. The district leaders were just going to go on, applauding till they fell where they stood, till they were carried out of the hall on stretchers. And even then, those who were left would not falter. Then after 11 minutes, the director of the paper factory assumed a businesslike expression and sat down in his seat. And oh, a miracle took place. Where had the universal, uninhibited, indescribable enthusiasm gone? To a man. Everyone else stopped dead and sat down. They had been saved. The squirrel had been smart enough to jump off his revolving wheel. That, however, was how they discovered who the independent people were. And that was how they went about eliminating them. That same night, the factory director was arrested. They easily pasted 10 years on him on the pretext of something quite different. But after he had signed Form 206, the final document of the interrogation, his interrogator reminded him, don't ever be the first to stop applauding. Can you imagine?
No, 11
Can you
minutes.
imagine
It's unbelievable.
of just fake applauding, just unreal. So that was the mindset. And going into the interrogation, and I would say at this point there are a couple things I wanted to share. Matt, I don't know if you have any thoughts on the interrogation process as we kind of dive in here.
Like I said, I'm almost surprised that they it almost seems like it's to bolster Stalin's like paranoia, right? Like, oh yeah, this person admitted that he is, anti-communist, anti, the regime or whatever. That almost seems like the reason that they get those, because it's weird that they even had to do these. Because obviously the it was such a farce, right? Any trial was a farce. The NKV, basically, the regime was so powerful and unable to be to have any flaws, that of course they couldn't do anything wrong. And you'll see that later in my book, where they talk about the end of the Gulag system and the end of really communism in Russia, that they can't even really admit that it was a mistake, that the Gulag and that Stalin was a mistake. And we'll talk about this probably a little bit. I just want to make sure I mention that it's interesting that there's very few, I guess, memorials to the Gulag people that died or survived. Whereas for the Jewish people, rightfully so, there's a lot of reminders to people as to what happened in World War II for the Jewish people. And it's just, and in my book, she talks quite a bit about how the Russian people almost just want to forget it. They don't want to remember it. Whereas the German people, it seems like they are very conscious and of making sure they remember the mistakes that their ancestors made. So anyway, I just think it's interesting because it goes to the whole mindset of Stalin at the time as to why they would need a fake, confession.
Yeah, if the system's
And
so good, if the government's so good, why do you have to
it's
imprison
infallible,
millions of
right?
people? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I had the same thought, Matt. That's interesting that you bring that up. We often talk about Nazi Germany and all of the atrocities happened there, but I do not recall ever really hearing about the Gulag archipelago or the prison system or this during communism growing up.
I
Maybe
only
faintly, but we don't talk about it. It's just not something that.
I think the only thing I remember specifically talking about was the famine years in the Ukraine.
Mm,
That's what I remember from the kind of the Cold War era. Um, that how many Ukrainian people died because of the famine. But you're right. I don't. It's not talked about. And again, that's not to say anything. Obviously the atrocities of the Nazi people
yeah.
were horrific. But I just am surprised that this is not as well known. Um, the atrocities of the Gulag
Yeah.
system.
Kind of
Anyway,
mind blowing, really,
yeah,
reading this
it's
book.
crazy. Yeah.
So they're arrested. Everyone's watching you. You're afraid to speak up when you are arrested. What happens next? You are taken to a prison cell, jammed into very tightly packed, I would say like sardines, maybe a prison cell that's built for 10 people, and they'll have 30, 40, 50 people all jammed in. He talks about just when one person moves, everybody else has to move in, and not being able to rest or lay down, and it's stifling hot. Everyone's breathing the same air. You can't get fresh air. And that was a tactic to make you uncomfortable, There were several different methods in the interrogation. Now, if you have small children or kids that might be sensitive to some of these things, I am going to read some of the techniques. So I would just say close their ears or come back to this part of the podcast later on without being too graphic. There are some graphic parts in this book, but he's trying to describe and be true to what actually happened. He said that the prisoners would have their skulls squeezed with iron rings. Human being would be lowered into an acid bath. They would be trussed up naked to the bitten by ants and bed bugs. That a ramrod heated over a primus stove would be thrust up their anal canal. That a man's genitals would be slowly crushed beneath the toe of a jackboot. That in the luckiest possible circumstances, prisoners would be tortured by being kept from sleeping for a week by thirst and by being beaten to a bloody pulp. Not one of the Chekhov's plays would have gotten to its end because all the heroes would have gone off to insane asylums. So those are some of the things that they did, I would say at the worst, interrogation methods. That there were things that they would do. He said the types of torture used were not regulated and every kind of ingenuity was permitted no matter what. So there were methods that they would do to torture the prisoner or interrogate them without leaving marks. And he lists out, this starts on page 103, he lists out 31 different methods. And I'm not going to read every method, but some of these were, I thought, I mean, they're all pretty sick. So it's interesting that a system like this could perfect the kind of pain and discomfort that someone would sign a document. That was their goal, was to, as you said, Matt, to have them confess, yes, I did this. So you're left between, do I stand for what's right, what's true, what did or didn't happen, or do I just confess and take my prison sentence and not go on to execution?
Yeah, let me just because I remember this part of his book, and you're not necessarily reading those 31 ones, but the one I remember because I actually did this because this is how weird I am. The one that he when he talks about having them on their knees, but their feet aren't able to touch the ground, so you're kind of leaning forward on your knees, and I'm like, nah, that doesn't seem too bad. I did it for like 2 minutes. I'm like, oh, okay, I did it. I confess. This is ridiculous. Like it's surprisingly painful just to sit or be on your knees with your feet off the ground. So you're kind of leaning forward. And he talks about them being like that for hours. And then they would just hit you
Yeah.
if you like touched your feet or whatever, even just standing around, right? Didn't they just make people stand for 24, 36 hours at a time?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yes.
and it's crazy. And the other thing that's interesting, and I don't remember if it's Solzhenitsyn's book or Applebaum, but they talk about how a lot of these people were true party believers and members, and they're like, what I didn't they truly didn't comprehend why they were arrested because they actually didn't do any of the things they said they did. And they were like, and they all kind of thought like, you know what, this is going to get figured out. This is, I believe in the system. They're going to figure this out. Sure, I'm going to, they finally give up and write something knowing that or thinking that they're going to get out of it somehow. And it's like, no, no, sorry. You signed your name on this. So it's pretty
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. We've got your signature right here after you've been tortured.
Exactly.
So one of the techniques, as you just described, having you stand for 3 days without sitting,
Without sleep too, right?
without
Like,
sleep, hot lights. I mean, again, these are all different methods to get you to just want to end the misery. He shares a common technique that was used. If you were married, they would leverage your family and start talking about arresting your wife, and
right.
they must be guilty too. And in the next room, you would hear a woman screaming, and they would say, "We have your wife. She's being interrogated in the next room." And you hear the woman screaming, thinking, I mean, you're half asleep. Your brain is exhausted. You're tired. You're foggy. You're just trying to hang on. And then they would put your face up to the window and you would see your wife with her head down walking past the door. So now it becomes real. Now, what the NKVD was doing is they'd bring your wife in, have a little chat with her, bring her into an office, and then they would have her leave. And as she was leaving, they would say, please keep your head down. So as she's leaving, they know that you're watching this window and you're about to see your wife walk past with her head down, like she'd just been screaming in the room next door, when that wasn't really that's not what really happened. But now you think, oh my gosh, like she's arrested too. And if I don't confess, so they would do just terrible
Mind
psychological
games.
things like that, mind
Yeah.
games.
Yep.
And your family may not even know where you are or what's
Right.
going on. He talked about getting on these prison cars and being transported, hundreds of miles away to these prison camps, to these labor camps that you talked about. He said they would threaten to arrest everyone you love. Sometimes this would be done with sound effects. Your wife has already been arrested, but her further fate depends on you. They're questioning her in the next room. So just as I mentioned, he he lays that out with just how they would break your will, sound effects, tickling,
Yeah.
cigar butts burning you, just just unimaginable things. I was reading this, I thought this would just be a terrible job. But sleeplessness was pretty common, and then bed bug infested box, where you would just be bitten and tortured in that way. So those were a lot of the interrogation techniques that they would use. You mentioned kneeling on your knees, beatings, um, putting you in a straitjacket. He talks about one breaking the prisoner's back, where you would lay on your stomach and they would tie your feet to your torso, and it just kind of stretched your body, and you're laying on your stomach
Yeah.
in that way. So just horrible, horrible things. So eventually the goal would be to, um,
Oh, are you muted?
sorry, just had to pause there for a second.
Okay, no problem.
But you would be tortured and in the interrogation until you would finally just, give up and sign the confession letter. So in the next section, what was interesting reading through the book, so you have your sentence. It was common to get a 10-year or a 25-year sentence or be executed. Uh, what was interesting reading through this is after the war was won. So reading this from this perspective of someone who's sitting in prison, Russia at this time in the 40s was an ally to the United States and to England fighting in World War II. So you have this atrocity happening at home in Russia, but they are fighting in World War II. Men are dying, fighting in the war, and you're in the prison. So you're kind of hoping that once the war is over, maybe we'll be released.
Yeah.
So he has this chapter called That Spring, when the war is won, and someone had written on a bathroom stall in soap up high, if there was any kind of writing, they did not want the prisoners communicating with each other. They
Right.
couldn't knock, they couldn't talk, they couldn't really communicate in any meaningful way, but someone had written it with a bar of soap that the war had been ended. And so they're all hoping that they'll be released, that they'll come in and say, your term's up, we won the war, go back home. But that's not what happened. They all pretty much had their sentences, and it continues on even after
Yeah, so
World
one
War
of the
II
things
ended.
that we probably should mention too is that one of the reasons that the Gulag, not just from a political standpoint to keep his people that opposed Stalin at bay, it was also their way of catching up in the industrial revolution, and they did it with kind of just throwing bodies at it with the volume of people. And Applebaum talks about them when they finally discovered gold in Colima, which is basically straight across from Alaska. So think north of the Japan Sea. So freezing cold temperatures, but they found gold there. So they just shipped a bunch of prisoners there. And interestingly enough, they needed some engineers to figure out how to mine. Well, what a surprise that there was three people that knew how to do mining were all of a sudden were against the the regime and were arrested because they knew how to mine. So one of the reasons, so I guess I just want to point out that one of the reasons that this system was in place was to work. So a lot of these people, when the war happened, they switched from like maybe chopping down wood to, sewing or making ammunition or things for the war effort. And so the prisoners were used a lot in the war effort as well, she mentions. So just to give some people some perspective as to why so many millions of people were in prison was not just political, but also to fuel their economy, really.
Labor.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So in communism, that was a pathway, was to imprison people and put them to work
Yep.
and make them suffer. Now, not everybody survived the prison camps. Many were executed from 1937 to 1938. So this is a quote from the book on page 438. He says the Yezhov men said that during those 2 years, so 1937 and 1938, 500,000 political prisoners had been shot throughout the Soviet Union, and 480,000 blatny, habitual thieves in addition. The thieves were all shot under Article 59-3 because they constituted a basis of Yagoda's power, and thereby the ancient noble companionship of thieves was pruned back. How improbable are these figures, taking into consideration that the mass executions went on not for 2 full years, but only for a year and a half? We would have to assume under Article 58, in other words, the politicals alone, an average of 28,000 executions per month in that period for the whole Soviet Union. But at how many different locations were executions being carried out? A figure of 150 would be very modest. There were more, of course. In Sakov alone, the NKVD set up torture and execution chambers in the basements of many churches, in former hermit cells, and even in 1953, tourists were still not allowed into these churches on the grounds that archives were kept there. The cobwebs hadn't been swept out for 10 years at a stretch. Those were the archives they kept there. And before beginning restoration work on these churches, they had to haul away the bones in them by the truckload. On the basis of this calculation, an average of 6 people were shot in the course of one day at each execution site. What's so fantastic about that? It isn't even an understatement. According to other sources, 1.7 million had been shot by January 1st, 1931. So there were a lot. As I was reading that, I was thinking, can you imagine that in the United States?
No,
Just
it's
29,000 people being executed
every month.
every month
Yeah.
in our prisons. Just, you know, it's just it's absolutely crazy. He also talks about hunger strikes, how that was a method for some prisoners just to get time outside, um, to have some free time. People would starve themselves for days on end. They would finally relent and put them in the hospital, force a tube down their throat to nourish them, and they would resist receiving that. Just
And they'd get
the
their teeth knocked.
absolute.
They'd get their teeth knocked out. He said, right? With
They would.
with when they're
They
trying to force feed them.
That's
It's
exactly
it's
right.
crazy.
So I want to just maybe end here, Matt, with this story. When I was listening to this book, I was on the freeway, and that's probably not a good time to listen to a book like this because your mind is just not really thinking about much. You're driving down the freeway, and I'm driving from southern Utah north, and he starts sharing this story. And I will say, I don't think I've remember reading a book or listening to a book where I just wept, but I heard this story. It makes me emotional thinking about it, but it is a really cool story. He talks about being in that prison, that special prison, purpose prison, uh, that pure, in some ways it purifies your soul. There's just not much. Things can't get worse than they are in that system, and some people perish or go insane. He says, if the first thing you see each and every morning is the eyes of your cellmate who has gone insane, How then shall you save yourself during the coming day? Nikolai Alexandrovich Kozrev, whose brilliant career in astronomy was interrupted by his arrest, saved himself only by thinking of the eternal and infinite, of the order of the universe, and of its supreme spirit, of the stars, of their internal state, and what time and the passage of time really are. And in this way, he began to discover a new field in physics. And only in this way did he succeed in surviving in Dmitrievsk prison. But his line of mental exploration was blocked by forgotten figures. He could not build any further. He had to have a lot of figures. Now, just where could he get them? In his solitary confinement cell with its overnight kerosene lamp, a cell into which not even a little bird could enter. And the scientist prayed, quote, "Please God, I have done everything I could. Please help me. Please help me continue." At this time, he was entitled to receive one book every 10 days. By then, he was alone in the cell. In the meager prison library were several different editions of Demyan Bedny's Red Concert, which kept coming around to each cell again and again. Half an hour passed after his prayer, then came to exchange his book. And as usual, without asking anything at all, they pushed a book at him. It was entitled A Course in Astrophysics. Where had it come from? He simply could not imagine such a book in the prison library. Aware of the brief duration of this coincidence, Kozrev threw himself on it and began to memorize everything he needed immediately and everything he might need later on. In all, just 2 days had passed, and he had 8 days left in which to keep his book. When there was an unscheduled inspection by the chief of the prison, his eagle eye noticed immediately, quote, "But you are an astronomer." "Yes." "Take this book away from him." But its mystical arrival had opened the way for his further work, which he then continued in the camp in Norilsk. So I just thought that was a really cool story, that in the very deepest, darkest places, this little miracle happens to this astronomer, and he continues on. He keeps going
And
after
he
his
had
little
didn't he
prayer.
have a career after he got out of
He
prison? I
did.
can't remember. Okay, yeah.
He did. Yeah.
Yeah. Did Okay, so I'm gonna let you rate the book in a second here, but I
All
got a
right.
question for you. And maybe I misunderstood. Didn't Solzhenitsyn participate in the White Sea Canal? Does he talk about the canal at all? Them digging the canal from the White Sea to I don't even know. Uh, no, doesn't ring a
I
bell.
don't remember that part. No,
Okay,
it's not ringing
so
a bell.
okay, because there's basically like a canal that I'll just tell the story real quick. And there's way more to it, but basically Stalin wanted this canal because of for shipping. It would save them like 450 miles or something of their shipping through the North Sea or something. So they wanted to build just basically like think of like the Suez Canal or something, right? That would make shipping much faster and easier. Well, they built it through slave labor, through forced labor, and they didn't even have the right tools. They had to build wheelbarrows out of their own wood. They're digging by hand, like homemade shovels, and just people are just dying. And it ended up being, and this was like the one thing that the Soviet propaganda people were like saying, look how great the Gulag system is these evil prisoners are building something for Mother Russia, or whatever. And and then once they finally finished it, they celebrated it. But it ends up like these big ships, it's too small. These big ships can't even go through it because it's too small of a canal. And it's just it's crazy. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But tell me your rating on this book, and then what, if anything, can you apply to your life, really?
Oh, I think there is a lot that I can apply to my life. I would give the book a grand slam. One of those things I think everyone at some point in their life should read. It's it was interesting. He has a great sense of humor despite all of the terrible things that he endured and all of these people endured. Like I said, you catch a lot of sarcasm in the book against the NKVD and just how ridiculous they were. The self-importance of the government and the state. From a personal perspective, in my mind, I was thinking, in the world, in governments, it seems that there's this pendulum that swings back and forth. It swings to the right, it swings to the left, and it can swing very hard one way or another. And have you ever heard of the horseshoe theory, Matt?
I don't
Does
think
that
so.
ring any bells?
No.
Okay, so there's this theory that if you take a horseshoe and you just hold it up with the two ends at the bottom and the U part at the top, like an upside down U,
Mm-hmm.
if the where the two ends connect, let's say that's just like the perfect center of politics. Like somebody, let's pretend somebody exists there. And one side of the horseshoe, let's say, is the political right. And as it has extremes, it starts to curve down. And the other side, let's say the left, as it continues down to the extremes, and they actually arc together. So you
Mm-hmm.
have fascism, let's say, on the right, and you have communism on the left, but they both end up behaving very similarly.
That's a great point.
And as I was reading this book, I was thinking, we have to be careful. I have to be careful to not let my mind swing in these extremes, and as a society to be careful to try to keep people grounded, because as you move in those extremes, you think, well, that would never happen in the United States. And I'm sure there were people in Germany, there were people in Russia that thought, oh, it would never happen here. But those extremes did happen, and all of these horrible atrocities did occur. So for me, it was just a reminder, like a self-reflection, to make sure that I'm not on any extremes, or try to avoid the extremes. And of course, if you're in the extreme, you don't think you're in the extreme, but then one day you're running a prison camp, you know. So let's not do that. I mean, the
Got it.
fact that we're having this conversation on a podcast in America, and I don't have any concerns about it being arrested today, is just a great blessing. I felt very grateful to live in the country that we live in.
For sure. All right. So I have a baseball analogy, because here's the way I imagine that we're pitching books to each other. And Zach is the pitcher who's very meticulous. His uniform looks unbelievable. He writes down every single pitch and mile per hour. He has a pitch map of where he's going. He takes meticulous notes. And then you got me, who comes in with like a dirty baseball uniform. Maybe hopefully it's the right color today.
Whatever.
I just grabbed a big old thing of Big League Chew, and I'm just like, oh, is it my day to pitch? Oh, okay. Where's the ball? I don't know what I'm doing. So that's how I feel today.
Oh,
Except I did make some notes. I'm a little bit like Zach today. I did take a few notes on this because this book is so intense. So I'm going to try to
well,
not be all over the place. I do have a few things to talk about and a couple things to read. So that's my analogy of how our personalities on the podcast.
okay. I have to compensate for my lack of talent. You are a natural pitcher. Let's
There you
just be
go.
honest here. You could just walk into anything and it's interesting to listen
Well,
to.
I don't know about that,
So,
but here we go. So
all right, let's have it. So tell me about the book that you read on the Gulag Archipelago. I would
yeah,
love to hear the perspective. You said that this book is more of a high level. So this is by Anne, and it's 700
and
pages.
Apple One is about 700 pages, 675. That's probably some notes and index stuff, but so 600 pages. Let's call it. And it's
And
about
she's more of a
20.
his okay, she's
Yeah,
a
historian. Yeah,
historian.
she's a Polish historian. This book won the Pulitzer Prize, well deserved. The thing that's cool about this is it came out in 2004, and so she had access. Obviously, Russia's a lot more open now comparatively, and so she had access to Russian archives. She speaks Russian. Um, and so she has access to not only what Solzhenitsyn wrote, and she does quote Solzhenitsyn quite a bit. But she has access to many, many memoirs that were not available in the past. So it's kind of a more overarching view of the whole Gulag system from the beginning to when it ends in the late 80s, early 90s, and how a lot of people in their mind think when Stalin died that the Gulag was over, and that's not even remotely the case. So it's a little bit more overview, But what I like about it is she'll give you kind of the overview, but then she will give you the little stories and little kernels of or anecdotes that talk about what are relative to or relevant to what she's saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's really cool in that sense. And like I said, I did sneak about a quarter of the book that you read, and I was gonna I meant to listen to the whole thing so I could just talk over you the whole time, but I didn't get that way. So anyway, it's really cool. And again, I'm gonna try even not to be too long, but this book is so dense with information and stories. I literally listened to it twice, and I feel like I barely scratched the surface. So let me just tell you a few things. And she kind of does a similar thing where she talks, like part one, she talks about the origin of the Gulag. I'm not going to read all these chapters. Part two is like the life and the work in the camps. So she talks quite a bit about the work and the industrial part of it. She does talk about arrest and prison, life in the camps, punishments, rewards, guards. One of the things that was really interesting to me is there was one particular smart guy who got arrested, and he got sent to camp, and he immediately just wrote this letter that said, this camp is run horribly. It's so disorganized. You guys should fix this, and this. And they're like, oh, you're pretty smart. Why don't you become a guard? So they made him a guard. And that was actually common for prisoners to become guards. And it's just crazy. Talks about women and children. She talks about the dying. A lot of these have Russian words. She talks specifically about people who are so hungry. She kind of calls them like the Walking Dead, where they don't care about how they smell. They don't care about going to the bathroom anymore. They don't care about their clothing. They don't, and they just know they're going to die, but they still are somehow alive. She talks about strategies for survival, escaping, the war, and she talks about a specific kind of people that were more um, as Russia took over different countries, they would exile people. So they wouldn't necessarily, maybe not even be in a camp, but they'd be sent from Poland to, the far east of Russia, or
Mm-hmm.
the Arctic Circle or whatever. She calls them strangers. Um, Talks a little bit about the amnesty. I don't know if Solzhenitsyn gets into that. There was a time when they did release a lot of people, and people were
Was
hoping.
this before
I think it was after Stalin died.
Stalinist Russia? Oh,
I think
it's after.
Stalin
Okay.
died, and Nikita Kresh, what's his name?
Brezhnev.
Yeah, he basically, like, he kind of admitted in a in a small internal meeting that some of what they were doing was wrong, and so they basically said, let some of these people out. But a lot of what was really interesting to me is how important this was to the, like I said before, the industrial complex of Russia, that they couldn't have. Sorry, I'm a little sick here. Make sure I don't cough too much. That they almost, I don't know if they had to do this, but they did this to kind of catch up with the West. Um, and there's basically all these economic reasons why it doesn't make any sense to have pay prisoners to guard these people that are unskilled laborers when they should have just paid skilled laborers to do this job.
Yeah.
So they finally kind of realize that when Gorbachev is around, is they're like, hey, this is actually pretty dumb. Like, we're spending more money, but she talks about how they'd falsify records to make sure
Running
that
these camps.
this gulag
Mm-hmm.
was financially successful, etc.
Right.
So anyway, it's so, there's so much. So I'm just gonna try to, let me go to my notes here and just tell you a little bit about what I remember to do. So one of the things I liked about it, she starts every chapter with like a quote or a poem by somebody, and then she starts, there's one proverb about prison that she writes. She said, he who has not been there will get his turn. He who has been there will never forget it. And
Yes.
that was the thing, is that everyone was going to be there. Like, everyone, so many people went, and the volume is insane. Um, One of the things that was interesting was the kolaks, I think is what it's called. That's kind of the peasants, the rich peasants, they called them. And one of the things that Russia did was they basically, no farms were individual anymore. They were all state owned. And so they just had to produce for the country. And a lot of people didn't like this because they could make their own money if they were, whatever. Anyway, so some people would get arrested literally for being a quote unquote rich peasant, which just made me laugh. I've never heard of a rich peasant before, but it's because maybe this guy had two cows and everybody else in the town had one. So he was rich, so he was arrested because he must have been cheating the system or something, right? So
And I don't know if she gets into the 7/8 law. It was a
I don't think
law that
so.
was passed on July 8th, which if you gleaned a little bit from the
Mm,
fields, if you took a little bit of the grain that from a field that belonged to the state or a
yeah,
cucumber or
right.
something like that, 10-year sentence.
Yeah, 10
You
years.
get sentenced off to prison.
Yeah.
Just
It,
no
it's
mercy.
it's crazy. And one of the other things that struck me as well was how inefficient they were at getting food to these people and how hungry they were all the time. Um, she talks about the people that were dying. They would hang out by the kitchen and eat any moldy scrap that got thrown out. They didn't care if it was a moldy cabbage. They would just eat anything they could. And she talks a lot about the rations of, this is they're somebody who's going out and chopping down trees all day gets 400 grams of bread. Like it's unbelievable. And then if you produced more, you would get more food. And so another thing that she talks about that I thought was really interesting, and I cannot remember the name of it, but it's basically like a Russian term for pretending to work, like kind of like slacking off and then making it look like you did something. And she said that that was so common, and almost the guards didn't even care sometimes. And one of the things that was a really funny story was a group of prisoners. They were in the foresting part of that. That was their job, just to go cut down trees for timber, as that was a good export. And they had to cut down a certain number of trees a day, but they called them the norms. Like, this is your quota, right? And the norms were so outrageous and so ridiculous. Like, people would cheat to get them. This is sorry. Let me back up just a minute. People would cheat to get them, and there was one prisoner who kind of worked out a deal with his guard who said, like, because if you hit the norm that day, you got more food. And there was one guy in like some sort of factory, and he said, look, what's kind of the average that we get per day? Okay, cool. And the norm is this. Let's make a deal. Zach gets the norm, or he gets above, so he gets more food on Tuesday, and then Matt gets more food on Wednesday because Matt hit above what he was supposed to. But nobody was actually hitting above. They just said, "Hey, our total is this. Zach did more work today. Julie did more
Yeah.
work this day," so that the whole team could get fed. But anyway, so the
Playing the
norm,
games.
yeah, playing the games. And one of my favorite things is the joke that they talk. Well, let me tell you the story real quick before I tell you the joke. Uh, they they were supposed to cut down a certain number of trees, and this guy who's new to the camp comes in, and he sees some person. I don't know if it was a guy or lady. They're just sitting down and relaxing with their axe. They're just like chilling, in this group of trees. And he's like, they're gonna kill you. Like, what are you doing? You're gonna like, you're not. This norm is impossible, even if you're chopping down all the trees you can. Um, and she's like, oh, like, just look over here. And there's just these stacks of timber that had been cut down but had never moved. And so she's like, if they come by and ask me how I did, I'll just tell them I did these. And they would just shave, and like, obviously the wood looks old, so they would
Yeah.
just shave, they would just cut off a tiny little bit to make it look like it was a fresh cut, and
Right.
act like they had done that day. So they're like, oh, this is awesome. They just got to relax in the forest for a few days when they could find
Perfect.
trees that had already been cut down but not been hauled off as timber.
And you could
So
increase your ration by cheating,
yeah,
by
exactly.
playing these ridiculous games.
And
Yeah.
and the quote that she's that the joke that she says is, uh, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work, right?
And didn't they, like, if you were caught not working, that was a revolutionary action. Like, you're harming the state because
Yes,
you're not working.
yeah. So you got put
So
in a
you could be
punishment,
executed or put in a
executed, or a
punishment
punishment
cell.
cell. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Or withhold, and then the punishment rations were much smaller than the normal rations. But I just can't get over how many people starve to death, and the stuff that
Yeah.
they're eating. They would just find random mushrooms in the field. So a lot of the she also talks a lot about how the political prisoners were a lot different than the normal criminals, and how a lot of the criminal element kind of ruled the gulags, a lot of the camps, because they were lifetime criminals, and they had friends. And basically, the political prisoners were a lot different. A lot of those guys actually did refuse to work and would do the hunger strikes. And the political prisoners would like threaten to kill somebody if they had to go work sometimes. Or there was like she talks about the doctors. In other words, there's this weird thing where, yeah, they're executing people in this camp, but they also have to keep enough people alive to produce enough timber or enough gold or whatever their camp was about. So they weren't allowed to have very many sick people. So like the camp, the main guard would come tell the doctor, you can only have 3 sick people a day. And meanwhile, there's like 30 people outside his door. And
Right.
so some of the true criminals would come in and threaten the doctor, say, our guys are sick today. These 3 guys are sick today, or we kill you. And there's times where they did kill the doctors because they wouldn't listen to. Anyway, it's so crazy to me what happened. Another thing that was interesting too is just the pointlessness of it all. There's a story about a lady who was assigned, her job was just to bring buckets of clay, walk them back and forth. So like that was her only job, and not dump them anywhere, not put them anywhere, just walk them back and forth. And she's asked why, and the guard says, "I don't need your work. I just need your suffering." And
Wow.
it's just it's so it's so crazy. The other thing that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it makes me want to go back and read before this period of time when all of this was happening
Mhm.
to what actually led. I don't know that I really understand, because you go from Tsarist Russia right into communism,
Mhm.
into Lenin, Stalin. I need to go back and just get a better understanding of what led to that. Like, what is the
Right,
psychological jump that the people make
right.
to the revolution? But it's like they went from one bad thing to something worse, because
Exactly.
Solzhenitsyn does talk about the prison system before the Gulag archipelago, where the prison systems became worse over time.
Right.
Prior, if you went on a hunger strike, they would make sure you ate. They would
Yeah.
give you what you needed. You could go out and walk around. There was grass. He talks about these prison camps. They eliminated all of the grass. There was asphalt, dirt, blurred windows so you couldn't see outside your prison cell, hot heat lamps in your cell. I mean, it was just a
Yeah.
torture to live.
Well, the other thing that strikes me too is the hunger, the punishing work and lack of food, and then also just how cold it was, right? Like
Yeah.
what's the coldest you've ever been? Can you recall the coldest you've ever been?
Yeah, it was December 25th of last year. My neighbor, he did it.
Oh,
He's
did you do the cold plunge?
it was the cold plunge.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
Yeah,
rough.
that's the coldest I've ever been. And that was lasted for 90 seconds. I tried to go a
Yeah.
full 2 minutes, and I think I made it for about 90, and I thought, I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm out.
So I spent a little time up in northern British Columbia, so near Alaska, and we were fully dressed, ready. You know what I mean? Like we were warm to the core or whatever. But the coldest it got out there that I remember, I think was like minus 38. Okay. When I was there, and that's including wind chill. Okay. So up in Colima, so the Colima Valley. The reason I listened to the book, but the reason I bought the book was just to look at some of the words so I could Google where Colima was because I
Okay.
didn't know how to spell it and stuff. And she does have good maps and stuff in here, and I'll show you guys a map in just a minute for those that are watching. But I it boggles my mind how cold it was. There were times they basically, she talks about, there was a rule in one camp in Colima that if it was negative 50, then they would quit working for the day. Negative 50. And
And I'm sure they were bundled up. I'm sure they
well, not
had,
really, because they didn't have, yeah, exactly. Oh, you're being sarcastic. Sorry. They my sarcasm detector was broken.
yeah, it is.
Uh the wind chill was not taken into account. So there were actually times when people would purposely get frostbite to have a day off of work. So they would cut holes in their boots and get frostbite and lose a couple toes so they didn't have to work the next day or whatever. The other thing sorry, back to the hunger, I just remembered the thing that boggled my mind. So just when you think of scurvy, you think of like 1492, Columbus, and not knowing why his shipmates' teeth are falling out. Well,
Yeah.
this is 1930s, 1950s. There's guys and gals getting scurvy in the camps because they don't have enough fresh produce. They're eating like a herring a day and some bread or some gruel or some, some
Hmm.
sort of stew. It's imagine
And it
that
was
scurvy in
horses. Yeah. Yeah.
yes, scurvy in 1945 up in the Arctic Circle of Russia. Like that is crazy to me. So anyway, those are some of the things that stood out. Um, the one thing that I wanted to mention too is again, they did a lot of this work to be, for the pride of Russia and so on. And I just want to read this story really quick. So she says, let's see, there were entire Gulag projects employing thousands of people and enormous resources, which proved spectacularly wasteful and ill-conceived. Of these, perhaps the most famous was the attempted construction of a railway line from the Volga region to the mouth of the Ob River on the Arctic Sea. The decision to start building was taken by the Soviet government in April 1947. A month later, exploration, surveying work, and construction all began simultaneously. Prisoners also began building a new seaport at the Katameni Cape, where the Ob River widens out towards the sea. As usual, there were complications. There were not enough tractors, so prisoners used old tanks instead. The planners made up for their lack of machines by overworking the prisoners. 11-hour days were normal. And even free workers sometimes stayed on the job from 9 o'clock in the morning till midnight during the long summer days. By the end of the year, the complications had grown more serious. The surveying team had established that the Kameni Cape was a poor location for the port. The water was not deep enough for large ships, and their land was too unstable for heavy industry. In January 1949, Stalin held a midnight meeting where the Soviet leadership determined to move the site and the railway to now the line would connect where the Ob was not with the Ob, but with the Vortka region to the west. Sorry, not with the Vorka region to the west, but with the Yezmeni River to the east. Two new camps were built, construction site number 501 and number 503. Each began to lay down railway track at the same time. The idea was to meet in the middle. The distance was 806 miles. Okay. Work continued at its height. So they'd wasted 2 years. The port's not good enough. And now
Right.
they're starting over, essentially. Work continued. At its height, there were, according to one source, 80,000 people working on the railway. 80,000. Another report had 120. The project became known as the Road of Death. Construction proved nearly impossible in the Arctic tundra. As winter permafrost quickly turned to summer mud, track had to be laid constantly. Track had to be constantly prevented from bending or sinking. Even so, wagons frequently came off the rails. Because of supply problems, the prisoners began using wood instead of steel for the railway construction. So you imagine wood tracks in the tundra. Okay.
Nice. Yeah. It's gonna real sturdy.
Yeah. A decision which guaranteed the project's failure. At the time of Stalin's death in 1953, 300 miles had been built from one end of the railway, 124 from the other end. The port existed only on paper. Within weeks of Stalin's funeral, the entire project, which had cost 40 billion rubles and tens of thousands of lives, were all abandoned for good.
Just a waste.
That is crazy. Like thousands of lives, billions of rubles for a project that was ill-conceived
Like
at the
talk
beginning.
about a bridge to nowhere. I mean, no purpose.
It's crazy. So anyway, that's I'm trying to think what else I want to talk. The one last thing I want to mention, and this is extremely
You know what that is, Matt?
yeah.
That mindset. It's like when you make a wrong turn on a road, most rational people would turn around and
Yeah.
say, if I keep going this way, I'm going to be lost forever. I'm
Yeah.
going to turn around. I'm going to backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
That is going so far as a society, like in the wrong direction and just not caring that you're going in the wrong direction, just a conviction of ego. It's like an ego inside of a society,
Yeah.
but just keep building. Don't care if they
It's
die.
it's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
I
Wow.
guess the thing that stuck with me is just the suffering, the cold, the lack of food, the torture, the extreme hard work that literally just kills people. Um, it, and there's not and it's not very well known, right? Like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, I'm not trying to disparage any other atrocity in the world because there's been many, but she talks about when she went to Russia to research this. She was on basically a ferry to one of the places in the archipelago, and people are asking her, "Oh, you're not, you speak Russian, you're Polish." She's Polish American. Um, what are you doing here? And she's like, I'm researching the gulags. And they're like, oh, old people are like, oh, just forget about it. They immediately quit talking to her. We don't want to remember that. Let's not talk about that.
Interesting.
And she basically just talks about how there's such a lack of memory of any memorials. She did go see a few kind of homemade memorials, like homemade wooden crosses,
Oh, really?
stuff like that. But they're not like what you would see in like Germany or Poland, like in Krakow, or Auschwitz is still there. Um, anyway, so it's that's why I think this book is so cool and important, and I think everyone should read it. The one last thing I'll leave you with, and this is probably one of the most shocking things that I read. When the war was over, a lot of people who were political dissidents, right? They left. They'd like go to, a lot of them went to Finland, and Russia and England agreed. I'm sorry, America and England agreed with Russia to send anybody who was Russian back to Russia, back to the Soviet Union. And there were so many people who did not want to go back because they were openly against, Stalin politically. And this story is unbelievable. She talks about how they would just pack them in these trains in Finland, these former Russians, and they knew they're on their way back to basically the death camps, right? They were certainly going to be executed because these were political prisoners that are political exiles. And she talks about how mothers would wait until they were on a bridge like the train was going over a bridge so they could throw their babies into the river,
Hmm.
knowing what would happen to them if they made it back to Russia, what was
Wow.
going to happen to them and their babies. And so I don't know if they were hoping that someone would rescue the baby. I don't know, but can you? I mean, that
It's
is
heartbreaking.
it's unbelievable. And so just I don't know. Again, this is a very heavy subject and such an interesting part of history, world history, that I just don't think a lot of people know about. And so that I also would give this book a grand slam. And again, it's so well researched, so interesting to me. I should say one of the things that I should say I didn't tell you how I found the book. I grew up, as a kid. I was in the 80s. I grew up in northern Utah and lived near an Air Force base. My dad was in the military, and you remember a little bit, right? Like there was the Cold War. I guess you were kind of young, but the Cold War to us was real, right? Like we literally would get under our desks and practice for like if a nuclear bomb was coming because we were next to an Air Force base. And I remember I had a friend who she was deathly afraid that we were going to get nuked because we were right by this Air Force base. My wife thought her dad was going to get called up into the army if because he worked on base as a civilian. She thought he was going to get drafted,
Yeah.
not knowing that that's not the case for how old he was. But so to me, I've always kind of been interested in the communist Russia, and it just is so interesting to me that and I'd read another book that's kind of about the fall of this. It's actually really good. I should review it sometime, but it's basically about how Russia went from communism to capitalism and all the crazy stuff that happened then. And so when I saw this, I'm like, oh man, I got to read this because it's just so cool. So anyway, I'd totally give it a grand slam. As far as application, I agree. It's just more. It's more like knowing the history and just kind of, I guess, comprehending how lucky we are to be where we are, right? And um, I don't know. I'm actually pretty interested. So I've obviously you can't go to Russia now, but I'd love to do it sometime just to see kind of the communist construction and things like that.
Yeah.
I am heading to Europe this summer, and we debated on going to Auschwitz. We're actually going to end up going to Munich and go to Dachau and
Oh,
see the
awesome.
prison camp there. So I'm excited to see stuff like that. But there really isn't anything like that that Anne talks about in Russia, and they're really probably should be, but of course, basically the Soviet government just, or the Russian government doesn't want to admit their own mistakes, right?
Right.
And anyway, so just I don't know what else
There's
to
a
say. It's crazy.
there's a history there, and it's not a short 2 or 3 year prison system. This is a multi-decade going in the wrong direction. And I hadn't thought about the monuments. That is interesting that it's one of those things where it's like we're just going to forget about it, that ever happened. But
I'm gonna share my screen really quick just to give people an idea that are watching to the volume of how many camps there were. Let me just do that really quick here.
and archipelagos, when you read that Gulag archipelago, you're thinking, are there islands in Russia?
Yep.
I mean, Russia is the biggest landmass country in the world. It
Right.
is massive. So, as you look at that map and see all of these this prison system, I think what was it, 150 or how many? What
I
was the
don't
estimate?
I don't know, but look at all those. I mean, look how big Russia
Yeah,
is, and that's where they were. Just to give some people some idea. Over here by Finland is where I think it's right here where the White Sea Canal was built. And then over here is Kolyma, where the gold mines were. But imagine trying to build railroads up here in in the Arctic.
jeez,
It is crazy.
in the winter.
She does talk a lot about how the winters were just brutal and the summers were just as brutal because of the mosquitoes. They said basically like your mosquitoes would just gather around you when you were eating. They'd fall into
Yeah,
your bowl, and it would be almost like a gruel, like a
just
buckwheat
mix
or
it in.
something. Yeah,
Yeah,
and they
like a
said
little
they
protein.
taste a little bit sweet. They basically said it was worse if you kind of swatted at them. The best thing to do was ignore them. I mean, it's they actually did torture by mosquito. I don't know if I didn't mention that. There was one person that they basically stripped him naked, tied him to a pole, and just let the mosquitoes have at him, and he actually died. I mean, it's crazy because he just was there. Anyway, so again, high recommendation. Again, thanks for sticking around, everybody, with
So good.
the
I learned a
the
ton.
double header. What any last parting words?
I think it's interesting to learn about. Countries can go off the rails. It can happen. And it's just important to remember where we are, your role within your little world, wherever you live, whatever you're doing, just try to keep things pretty centered and balanced and feel pretty good. In the US, we have I think a pretty decentralized system of government, state, local, city, national, federal. And you hope it always remains that way, because when it doesn't, that's when it can go off the rails. So Matt, I really appreciate the opportunity to do this doubleheader with you. It was really fun to kind of learn more about the Gulag archipelago with you.
Yeah, it's agreed. So we don't normally do this. Normally it's a we don't know what the person's going to pitch. But this was kind of a special one, and hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for listening, everybody. Please like, subscribe, and share with your friends, and give us some feedback too if that's something you guys liked. Kind of the same subject, different books, and see if that's something you guys want to do in the future. Appreciate everyone that listens, and we'll talk to you next time on the Pitch Book Podcast.